Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Georgia and Russia are not at peace. They have no embassies, no diplomats, no signed ceasefire that actually ended the war of 2008. 1/5 of Georgia's territory is still occupied. And yet, flights are back, visas are gone, trade is growing, and Moscow is smiling like nothing ever happened. So tonight, we're talking about a relationship that officially doesn't exist, but very clearly does. A partnership nobody actually voted for, built not on reconciliation, but on elite convenience. Welcome to the strange world of Georgia and Russia, enemies in public, business partners behind closed doors. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Georgia says it will not restore diplomatic relations with Russia unless Moscow reverses its recognition of two breakaway regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. These territories make up about 20% of Georgia's land and have been under Russian control since the 2008 war, when Russia recognized them as independent states. Only a handful of countries share Russia's view. Most of the world considers Abkhazia and South Ossetia a part of Georgia. Prime Minister Irakli Kobakhidze called the issue non-negotiable, saying Georgia's position is tied to ending what it sees as an occupation. Russia, however, says its recognition of the regions is irreversible and calls Georgia's demands unrealistic. Despite the political freeze, trade between the two countries continues. Georgia exports wine, mineral water and nuts to Russia, while Russia in return supplies natural gas. In fact, bilateral trade between the two nations topped $1.3 billion in the first half of 2025. The Georgian Dream was founded and is led by Bedina Ivanishvili, the richest man in the country. The oligarch made his wealth in Russia in the 1990s following the breakup of the Soviet Union. Critics say Georgia's ruling party has softened its stance toward Moscow while cooling ties with NATO and the European Union. For now, though, diplomatic relations remain at a standstill.
And now we're zoning in on the East-splaining portion of our show. Abkhazia's new de facto Minister of Foreign Affairs, Oleg Bartsits, says Georgia must scrap its law on occupied territories and sign a non-use of force agreement with Abkhazia and South Ossetia before relations can improve. The Georgian law, adopted after the 2008 war, makes it illegal to enter the breakaway regions from Russia.
Abkhazia's newly appointed de facto Minister of Foreign Affairs, Oleg Bartsits, is setting conditions conducing to improving relations with Georgia. Speaking to Russian media, Bartsits said Tbilisi must abolish its law on occupied territories and sign a treaty pledging the non-use of force with Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Georgia argues it has already committed to non-use of force under the 2008 ceasefire and then reaffirmed a unilateral pledge in 2010, which was confirmed by letters to the UN and EU. Abkhaz and Ossetian leaders also issued similar pledges. Russia, however, refused. Bartsits insists that real steps are needed before talks can move forward, assuring that these issues will be raised in upcoming Geneva discussions. His appointment comes as Abkhazia's new leadership signals a tougher line in negotiations with Tbilisi.
And now, as always, it's time to explore the issue in greater detail. So, let's begin. If you ask ordinary Georgians who their country's main enemy is, the answer is not complicated. It's Russia, and it's not even close. Nearly 70% of the population sees Moscow as hostile, and the single biggest reason Georgia is stuck outside the European Union. This view cuts across generations, regions, even political camps. And yet, Georgia's ruling party, Georgian Dream, governs as if that sentiment were an inconvenience rather than a mandate. In early 2025, a Russian think tank praised Georgia's official messaging as relatively friendly towards Moscow. That tells us less about Georgia's diplomacy and more about Russia's expectations, in fact. Because in reality, this is not a partnership in the normal sense. It's a quasi-partnership, transactional, asymmetrical, and driven by elite interests rather than national strategy. Let's start with the basics, shall we? Georgia and Russia have no diplomatic relations. Russia occupies Abkhazia and South Ossetia, also known as the state of Alania. The Georgians actually refer to it simply as the Tsingvali region, by the way. No peace treaty has ever been signed. Legally, Georgia is still at war with Russia. And yet, since 2023, Moscow has been trying to manufacture an illusion of normalization. Flights have been resumed, and visa requirements were scrapped. Russian officials repeatedly floated the idea of restoring full diplomatic ties, with Moscow declaring in February 2025 that it was ready to go as far as the Georgian side is ready to go. Because Georgian Dream knows exactly how unpopular such a move would actually be. You see, restoring ties with Russia isn't just controversial in Georgia, it is politically radioactive. Any government that openly embraces Moscow risks mass protests and electoral collapse. So Georgian Dream plays a double game: quiet alignment with Russian preferences, loud insistence that Russia remains a threat. During the run-up to the 2024 parliamentary elections, Georgian Dream leaned heavily into insinuation that by easing tensions with Russia, Georgia might somehow regain the occupied territories. No specifics or timelines, but just enough ambiguity to suggest a miracle without taking responsibility for it. Meanwhile, the Kremlin's actual demand went in the opposite direction: that Georgia formally demarcate the administrative borders with the occupied territories. That alone exposes how hollow Georgia Dream's narrative really is. But Moscow doesn't need Georgia to believe, it needs Georgia to comply. This reverses decades of policy. Previous governments worked actively to reduce dependence on Russia, knowing full well how Moscow weaponizes energy. Georgian Dream's entire pitch for staying in power rests on fear. Russia is the threat, and only Georgian Dream can keep it at bay. But here is the paradox. Georgian Dream's quiet accommodation strengthens Russia's leverage, not Georgia's security. This quasi-partnership survives only as long as elite interests align. A change of government in Tbilisi or a change of calculation in Moscow could end it overnight. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Tinatin Akhvediani, Research Fellow, EU Foreign Policy Unit, Center for European Policy Studies. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you so much for having me.
So in a nutshell, how would you describe the relationship between Georgia and Russia today?
I mean, there are no diplomatic relations between Georgia and Russia today. However, Georgia's current government has been very much taking actions and has been verbalizing the things that Kremlin really wants to hear and see in Georgia. So Georgia has been going with the direction and very much in the playbook of Moscow, playbook of Russia. And this is as a matter of fact. As we know, Georgia has not joined the sanctions against Russia since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the last parliamentary elections, which has been very, very important event for Georgia, which has lacking and is lacking legitimacy, has been positively praised and recognized by Moscow, and Lavrov even made a statement last year. Since then, every action taken by the Georgian Dream is usually supported by Lavrov's statements or the other statements we hear from Moscow.
So effectively the pro-Western aspirations of society, of the majority of society, are being held back by the Georgian Dream Party, but they are also demarcating certain limits, like, for example, official diplomatic relations with Moscow. Prime Minister Kobahidze said, we're not doing that because you're not giving back our territories. Moscow insists that they are not your territories, they are separate states. Nobody recognizes them apart from Moscow and a very few other countries across the world. So would you say that the Georgian Dream Party really is kind of trapped within its own narrative to some extent?
They're not trapped. I think they're just pushing the narrative they would like to push without causing outrageous public, opposition. And I'm going to explain here why. So diplomatic relations with Moscow, with Russia, have been stopped in 2008. This was the government before the ruling party, before the Georgian Dream would become a ruling party in the country. So that decision was made by then. Simply what the Georgian Dream is doing, Georgian Dream is not coming back to the resumption of the diplomatic relations, or let's say not yet, because we don't know what exactly they have in mind. However, at the same time, what we saw very clearly is that Georgia has welcomed all the influx of the Russian remittances, Russian money, and Russian citizens since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. There was no resistance whatsoever from the government to even, check, monitor, filter, or simply not allow Russian influx into the country. They very much welcomed this, not only for that, but also, the movement of the goods across the borders. We saw so many trucks that were stuck on the borders with Georgia, which allowed really, Russia to somehow access through the Eurasian Economic Union the goods that have been sanctioned under the EU sanctions and the rule book. So these are going hand in hand. So the actions really speak otherwise. At the same time, we should also hear what is going on currently in Georgia. The latest statements of the prime ministers indicate what he has recently said, that Georgian citizens in Russia do not have right to vote. So this is also, pinpointing or hinting into the thinking of the Georgian Dream. So they are already preparing for the next election cycles, and they already want to give the voting rights to the citizens who live in the country where there are no diplomatic relations, right? There are no diplomatic relations currently between the two countries. And if you think about it, that may at some point trigger them saying, look, we may even resume the diplomatic relations, not because we want to recognize the independence of South Ossetia or Abkhazia, but because we want to give the voting rights to those citizens, Georgian citizens living in Russia. This is extremely tricky, and if you really think about it at the expert level, but even without experts level, you see that this can be linked to a lot of security threats, because currently Russia is really not a democratic state. It's an authoritarian state, and any voting taking place on the ground in Russia should not be, taken seriously.
So if they did that, effectively that would allow them to wriggle out of this contradiction, because, as you've mentioned, they are doing pretty much everything to prove, as a matter of fact, that they are a pro-Russian party. But they are vehemently denying this, and they are using this window dressing of not having diplomatic relations with Moscow and maintaining this, consistency of policy with previous governments concerning, the illegally occupied territories. But beyond this, this seems to be the only thing that they can show for not being pro-Russian. How do they manage this convoluted narrative? Isn't it the case that the voters are looking at this and saying, hold on, something just doesn't add up? You're saying that Russia is a threat. You're saying that we are protecting you from Russia. Also, you're implementing policies which are pretty much cloned from Russia. How does it work with their own voter base?
Indeed, their own voters, and in general, this can be very confusing for the public, and this is exactly what they're doing. They're creating the confusion. They're creating the propaganda that, is it just the right level of the confusion, so that at some point when you repeat those confusions, they just become normalized across society. But this is very, very scary, what, we may see in Georgia, but as you said, this is exactly their strategy. So verbally, they say, yes, indeed, we are not going to recognize the independence of the breakaway regions, but the actions they're taking are very much nearing that line. Another thing that happened in Georgia within the past weeks is that currently Georgian government has also abolished the administration representative of the South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia. So basically government in exile, right? So they have also been abolished. And this is something Moscow has been requesting for years, that those administrations should be abolished, and now they're abolished for completely different reasons that the prime minister or the government officials are saying. But the end result is exactly what Kremlin wants to see. So basically, they're twisting the narrative, but their actions lead to the results that very much Kremlin wants to see in the country. And this is really, really concerning.
So another argument that they are using is that, look, we need economic cooperation. Economic cooperation brings jobs, it brings economic growth, it's good for us. But is it really? When you look at how the cooperation with Moscow is shaping up, is this beneficial for Georgia, or is that another false narrative?
This is another false narrative, and here we do need expertise, because what happened in Georgia since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, country has seen double-digit growth of its GDP. First of all, GDP does not show how the welfare is distributed. GDP does not show whether economic growth is sustainable. It's just a number, and we need to know how to interpret it. What GDP growth showed, was the massive boost in aggregate spending. Aggregate spending, and aggregate demand that was very much sourced by the money influx from Russia and the big influx of Russian citizens in the country. What it actually translated into for Georgian citizens was that prices were spiked up because there was increased demand without meeting increasing supply, right? So production capacity didn't change of the country. We did not produce more. We did not become more productive or more efficient. Simply, there was a higher demand of already existing goods. In this situation, we have inflation. So prices skyrocketed. The rent went really up. So the living expenses for ordinary citizens, and particularly for poor, particularly for vulnerable, really skyrocketed. So in the end, this double-digit growth that country has seen has been extremely beneficial for those who came to country, which are usually driven from Russia, but that have been very detrimental for the cost of the living, and for all the quality of the life for ordinary citizens in Georgia, and the country's economy is still recovering. What we are witnessing now is really the drop into the GDP growth, which was very much expected, and we have to see to what extent this can be boosted back. Russia currently has always been a poor economy overall, currently is in a big economic mess, and we cannot possibly say that we want to benefit from building any sort of relations in the country which is under sanctions, and which we don't know how long it will cope under the international pressure. It's simply false.
And now, speaking of sanctions, the Georgian Dream government is known for facilitating the evasion thereof. An example was given recently that Spain actually bought substantial quantities of Georgian oil. Now, Georgia doesn't really have oil fields of its own. What does it tell us about the current situation in this regard?
This is exactly what it tells us, that country has become really the field or the area where Russian goods can be transported back to the European Union, indeed through the evasions, because officially we do not have records that Georgia has violated any sanctions, but there are ways to avoid, sanctions evasion. So bringing back indeed the oil, which country obviously doesn't have. We don't produce any oil or any gas. We are importers of those. So we cannot possibly export. So these are re-exports, and then the source of the export should be questioned, and indeed that's very likely that comes from Russia, right? But on the other hand, Georgia also allowed the trade, the goods that have been sanctioned under the European Union to also reach to the Eurasian Economic Union and eventually to Russia. What we are speaking here, these are consumer electronics. These are a lot of goods that fell under the category of sanctions, but there was a high demand in Russia on those goods, and Georgia, as well as Armenia and other countries in the region, have become these areas or the field of, the buffer zone, where those goods somehow would reach these countries that are not sanctioned, and this would be kind of a corridor for those goods to eventually reach Russia. So at the end, what we see, Russia benefiting, right? And somehow, directly or indirectly, this is still possible in Georgia.
Tina Tinach-Vlatiani was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thanks for having me.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Earlier this week, a plane carrying dozens of Russian citizens deported from the United States landed in Moscow. Human rights advocates fear some of them could face prison or even military conscription.
Yet another batch of Russian citizens got deported back home. According to Russian diaspora leader Dmitry Valuyev, several of those deported held anti-government views, making them vulnerable to political persecution. Media reports suggest 64 people were on board. The male members of the group received military summons immediately upon landing. The plane left Arizona on December 7th, stopping in Egypt before continuing to Moscow. This was the third such deportation flight under the Trump administration, following similar flights in June and August. Thousands of Russians have sought asylum in the US to escape persecution, but many of them have been caught in immigration crackdowns. Past cases show that deported activists and draft dodgers often face harsh sentences back home.
The Russian State Duma has voted to lower the age for taking the citizenship oath. Lawmakers say the move is meant to boost patriotism among young people.
Starting soon, teenagers as young as 14 will have to swear allegiance to Russia before they can become citizens. The oath, introduced in 2017, requires pledging fealty to the country's culture, history and traditions. Until now, only adults 18 and older had to take it. Lawmakers say lowering the age will help instill a patriotic spirit early and make sure young people understand their responsibilities under the law. The new rules also tighten enforcement. If someone refuses to take the oath or doesn't show up for it within a year's time, their citizenship will be denied. The bill still seeks approval from the Federation Council and President Vladimir Putin before becoming law.
Kazakhstan is rerouting oil exports after Ukrainian drone strikes crippled a key Black Sea terminal. For the first time, crude from the giant Kashagan field is heading to China instead of Europe.
The Kashagan field, one of the world's biggest oil discoveries in decades, usually sends most of its output through the Caspian Pipeline Consortium to Russia's Novorossiysk port. From there, tankers deliver oil to European markets. But recent Ukrainian strikes damaged critical loading ports at the terminal, leaving only one of 3 moorings operational. The Kazakh Energy Ministry says exports haven't stopped completely, but rather have been redistributed through alternative routes. Europe relies on CPC crude for more than 11% of its oil imports, with Germany, Italy and the Netherlands among the biggest buyers. A prolonged disruption could force Kazakhstan to rethink its delicate balance between Russia, China and the West, a balance it has maintained for 3 decades.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.